So we started this retreat by talking about the fundamental reason for having a practice, which I said if we had to have one word, it would be happiness, but then we would want to very quickly say happiness broadly and deeply defined. So in terms of broad, we'd want to make sure that people's notion of happiness was not limited to just things like getting conditions to be a certain way or having certain kinds of sensory experiences, um, and so forth, which would make practice look sort of narcissistic if that's all it's about. And there's bad optics with practice because the seated practice in stillness does sort of look like we're withdrawing and disengaging from the outer world. Now we know that, of course, there are techniques that are like that, but that's only a small piece. The bigger picture, we're clear about what that is. So we want to make sure that skillful action in all of its meanings and call to service in all of its meanings, that's included so that our definition of happiness is broad. It includes relief, fulfillment, insight in the sense of understanding yourself at all levels, including the deepest, mastery in the sense of mastery of one's actions, and service. So we want to make sure it's broad. We want to make sure it's also deep. Most people are not aware that happiness independent of conditions is a viable possibility for most people. They just don't know much about that or anything about that. That's the deeper parts of happiness. The ability to essentially, it boils down to the ability to have complete sensory experiences. And that is directly related to the ability to escape into physical, emotional suffering, escape into it, experience it so fully that it tastes like cleansing and empowerment. Analogously, experience pleasure as the same thing, a purification, an empowerment. Experience the arising of the ordinary self, the self that 平常心, that thinks about this, that is confused about this, that, it wants this other thing. To experience the arising of the ordinary self from the extraordinary. Call it true self, call it no self. That's a big piece of happiness independent of conditions. So we want to make sure that people's understanding of happiness is also deep. There are two reasons to talk about this. One is what I just said, a complete paradigm of the effect of the practice will include all of this. The other is a clarification thing. People often get confused by seemingly natural dichotomous thinking. Well, should I be working on uh, my own personal happiness, or should I be engaged um, in service and concern for others? And that or is perceived as an exclusive or, like it's one or the other. But it is profoundly both and. The same skill set, the same strategies are applied to both, are relevant to both. The other confusion, well, should I transcend or should I take care of business? Once again, perceived as an exclusive or, it's both and. And in fact, I would say that the hallmark of contemplative maturity is when one realizes the complementarity of all of these dimensions, and it becomes one process and it's not confusing anymore. It's a proportion. We devote a proportion of time and energy to this quadrant, to that quadrant, to this level, to that level. And it's a pacing. At certain times, those proportions may change. But we shouldn't find ourselves in some sort of fundamental confusion about um, the unity of uh, the goals of this path. So why I mention this is because of the unusual situation that we find ourselves in now with the world and a pandemic. So certainly part of what we're called to do is take care of stuff in various ways. It should be evident how focus skills and techniques are relevant to effective action in the world. But it's also a time where we're sort of forced, and by we I mean all human beings, we're forced to remember the big picture, particularly those of us that have a practice, because we've already been told, we know, or at least we should know, that conditional happiness is impermanent. We do our best to get it to last, and nothing wrong with that. I know this is a bad thing. But to tell you the truth, those of you that are old enough to remember what it was like growing up in the US in the 1950s, I really thought when I was 8 years old that I would experience World War III because of the bad relationships with Russia and China. We just expected to be bombed. I did as a kid. It was horrible. We had drills. Get under your desk. That'll help. So, I mean, not to take things lightly, but I really thought I'd live to see a lot worse, and maybe I will. But the fact is, we do our best, and conditional happiness comes to an end. Then we can work for some other conditional happiness until it's time to die, and then we have to sort of face the final reality. Um, this doesn't, for us, this is just being grown up. This is not pessimism. This is not morose. It's just realistic. Now, I think the reason that people think this is a pessimistic view, I'm not saying we can't make all sorts of terrific improvements. I think we can make this world into a kind of paradise in the next few centuries. But impermanence, in doing that, we will evolve into some other form. Um, so, impermanence. Uh, those of us that know this are prepared. We have a sense of how to be happy independent of conditions. Some of you know the French philosopher Pascal said something to the effect of, if I, the effect of uh, all human problems stem from the fact that people can't just sit in a room day after day with nothing else and be perfectly happy. But actually, we can. People with the practice can, meaning people with the practice have addressed happiness at this deepest level. The world as a whole is now being forced into a kind of non-consensual ashram, a global uh, imposed retreat, in a sense, at least on a physical level. And people are freaked out, which is a bad thing, a sad thing. But also, it's in times like this that people are open to making changes. There's plasticity that can be associated with that. I remember what it was like to go from cushy California lifestyle at at the age of 25, to go from that and suddenly I'm in a Japanese monastery where it's every day is samurai boot camp training. Wow, it was quite a shock. And I remember how fluid I had to become to deal with that. It was like I just had to let go of the fixated perimeter and the coagulated center. It was just so different. So the positive spin that we take from this is that we all, in one way or another, have a calling here. We who understand this larger context and have resources. I think that the reason people don't want to look at the conditioned nature of conditional happiness, people probably don't want to look at it because they don't know there's an alternative. So if there's no alternative, then it's like I just latch on to this thing, even though eventually it's not going to hold. We know there's an alternative. We know for sure. We know in specific. We know the details. We have a lot to give at many levels. So for us, we freak out just like everyone else, but not quite just like everyone else. Um, we we utilize the adversity for optimal growth. So this is my second experience of running a retreat in the midst of a crisis. I actually mentioned the first night the 9/11 attack hit smack dab in the middle of a 10-day retreat that we were having in Virginia, not all that far, actually, from the areas that had been affected. And I remember the retreat managers came to me during that time in the technique instruction where everyone goes off to practice in motion. So we were done with the guidance. The retreat managers come to me and they whisper in my ear their understanding of what had happened. It had actually only happened a few minutes before. And of course, the understanding was very distorted and incomplete. The initial impression I got was that we were actually like at war, that there was, exchange of hot warfare between us and someone else. And it wasn't, it took quite a while before sort of a realistic assessment. And we were close to the action too. It's like, are we going to like see bombs dropped or something like that? One Zen master I used to work with used to say, "Sate, jishin ga kitara dou suru?" So, what are you going to do when the earthquake comes? There's going to be some sort of earthquake. So that was an earthquake. And I remember, some of you know this story, but when they told me in Talkspace, auto-think, just out of nowhere, paraphrasing Yeats, the phrase, "the center will hold," came to my mind. In other words, we're not going to just let this retreat dissipate, even if we are at war. We're going to hold it to whatever extent that's physically viable, including keeping the silence and so forth. And it was amazing how everyone rose to the occasion. The center did hold. I think our Methodist minister hosts, so it's a Christian Protestant venue that were used in sort of rural Virginia. I think that they saw the power of mindfulness by the way we all sort of self-organized into something amazingly effective. In fact, 2 years later, much to my amazement, those Methodist ministers asked me to give a talk to their Christian youth group. Now, with Catholicism, we have this kind of thing all the time. We don't get it as much with Protestants, especially sort of down south in the US, but it was, the whole thing was enormously empowering. And I suspect that many of us at, at this point, having completed this strange new way of being together and being apart, um, I think many of us may have that sense that we're empowered by this. I certainly do. When we, so we, you can imagine that the talking circle, after processing the attack, we processed it for 5 days in silence. I mean, people that needed to make calls and so forth, of course, did that, but essentially we kept the silence. So the talking circle was different. And we had this sense that, okay, we're going to walk out of here and it's going to be strange out there. And those of you that were in this country at that time will remember it was very, very strange for a few weeks. But we all knew that we had something to give. Remember the ox herding pictures? The 10th step, the yung, the use. There's the T, the substance, which is just nothing. There's the sha, which is the appearance, which is everything. And then there's the yong, which is to enter the marketplace with hand outstretched. You have these goodies, and you don't push them on anyone. But if people have the eye to see, they'll notice that you're Santa Claus with a big sack of toys for all ages. So that's, I think, a theme for us to consider. On the more analytic side, it occurred to me there's something every one of us can do at one level or another in this situation to optimize what Shakespeare called the uses of adversity. One level is institutions. And of course, within institutions, there's everything from, your neighborhood, whatever, to your municipal, state, provincial, even national government. I've been told that several cities are officially telling people to meditate, actually using the M word. So things that we could do to help the institutions that we may have connection with to bring in these practices, to create resources. I've been told, once again, this is hearsay, but someone told me that Bright Mind is making itself free now to the world in this time of stress. Makes sense that we would do something like that. So there are things that we might be able to do at institutional level. Then there are things that we could do with the world meditation community. We just ran a pretty effective retreat um, without having ever done anything like this, because our structures have been so carefully thought through. Every aspect of it has been so carefully organized and may sort of pared down to a lean machine that gets the job done. Other meditation type organizations may or may not realize they can run these kinds of programs, and it is to great effect. I certainly noticed more carryover into daily life type effects from this retreat than I would from the kind of retreat where we just leave everything. So, I mean, everyone says, hey, what about in between retreat? Well, doing the retreat at home with all of the karmic consequences, wow, we did it. And other practice groups that may be based entirely on a physical community type organization, they may not realize that we can still have very effective practice, even during this time of official social isolation around the world. So some of us would reach out to other communities and say, hey, look, Unified just did this and it worked out quite well. I'm sure many of them are already considering this, but we have already a proven format. So there's that. Then there's the level of reaching out to the people of the world that may be now ready for a practice because they've bottomed out on conditional happiness and they're being forced into a sancta simplicitas, a sacred simplification, except it doesn't look sacred, it looks the opposite of that. So we may be able to reach people who are now ready, who weren't ready a few weeks ago. There's that level. And then finally, there's the fundamental level. That's the level of our own personal example, the subtle teaching, the support that every practitioner gives simply by being a practitioner. It may be subtle, but it's not insignificant, especially the cumulative effect on the people around us. I mentioned the practitioner, Jingtu, purifies the land, meaning everywhere we walk, we sort of are filtering, we pick up the poison and pain, sympathetically vibrate with it, process it, so that we're helping others and helping ourselves almost on autopilot at the primordial level of the senses. This is a significant contribution that we can all make. We think of the uses of adversity, it's from Shakespeare, actually, As You Like It. So this a person has I think that they were a noble man of some sort, and then they got exiled by their evil brother, something like that, and they're forced to live in isolation. But this person finds it actually enormously fulfilling. And here is the direct quote. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. Apparently, there was a belief about toads and money or jewels. If you're from China, you know you have the same thing, right? The money toads. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. I thought that was a nice summary of the way that I like to think of our situation. Yes, we're going to take care of business. We're going to not give conditional happiness short shrift. But let's remember, sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything.